The bin was heavier than usual that Thursday morning. I remember thinking that as I dragged it down the driveway, the wheels catching on the crack in the concrete I'd been meaning to fix for 3 years. It was just past 7, and the Mornington Peninsula was doing what it does best in late autumn. That low gray light that makes everything look like it's holding its breath. I was 63 years old, semi-retired from 30 years in civil engineering, and my biggest concern that morning was whether the council would collect the green bin or skip it again. That was my life. Quiet. Ordered. Predictable. That was the last quiet morning I would have for a very long time. My neighbor from across the road, Graham Sutton, was standing at his letterbox when I looked up. 71 years old. Retired. School teacher. Widower. His wife Pam had passed from a stroke 2 years prior, and he'd spent the time since keeping his garden immaculate and walking his kelpie every morning at 6:30 sharp. We'd been neighbors for 18 years. Not close, but the kind of solid that comes from lending each other tools and sharing a beer after mowing. Good man. Honest man. He wasn't walking the dog that morning. He was just standing there, watching me, with an expression I'd never seen on his face before. Something between discomfort and resolve. "Graham," I called out. He crossed the road without a word until he was close enough that he didn't need to raise his voice. He took his cap off, turned it over in his hands. "I've been trying to work out how to say this for about a month," he said. "My name is Robert Hadley. I'd been married to my wife, Diane, for 31 years. We had a son, Callum, who was 28 and had moved back in with us 14 months earlier after his relationship ended. I traveled interstate perhaps once a month, sometimes to Sydney, sometimes Brisbane. Standard stuff. 3 or 4 nights at a stretch. Graham told me that on those nights, a car had been arriving at my house. A dark green Range Rover, newer model. He'd first noticed it in early March. The driver, a man, tall, silver-haired, probably mid-60s, had a key. Walked straight in, no hesitation. Stayed the night. Was always gone before 7. He'd counted at least 8 visits. The morning air felt like it had dropped 10 degrees. I stood there with the bin lid still in my hand, and I made myself breathe. "You sure it's the same car? Same man?" Graham looked at me steadily. I wrote down the plate the 3rd time. I kept telling myself it was probably family, that there was some explanation, but it kept happening. "Always the nights you were away. Never when you were home." He paused. "I'm sorry, Robert. I genuinely am." I told him I appreciated it. I told him it was probably nothing. I told him I'd look into it. I walked back inside on legs that didn't feel entirely mine. Diane was in the kitchen. 61 years old, dark hair. She kept short now. Reading glasses, pushed up on her head. She worked part-time at a medical administration firm in Rosebud. We'd met at a work function in 1993 when I was 29 and she was 28. And she'd laughed at something I said, and I'd been a goner from that moment. 31 years. You think you know a person completely after 31 years. You think there are no rooms left you haven't been in. Callum was at the kitchen table, scrolling through his phone. He glanced up when I came in and went straight back to the screen. I sat down and I made myself act normal. I poured coffee and I made small talk about the weather forecast, and I watched them both very carefully, for the first time in what I realized, with some shame. "Graham seems a bit off lately," I said casually. "Just stopped me in the street to talk about nothing much. You know how he gets." Diane's hand stilled on her coffee cup for just a moment. Callum's thumb stopped scrolling. It lasted maybe 2 seconds and then they both recovered, but I'd seen it. The micropause, the reset. "He's been lonely since Pam died," Diane said, her voice perfectly calibrated. "You should invite him over for dinner sometime." "Yeah," Callum said. not looking up. Poor old blokes probably just starved for company. I nodded slowly. You're probably right. They thought I'd accepted it. I watched the ease return to Diane's shoulders, watched Callum reach for his toast with the relaxed movement of someone who believed the danger had passed. I had a consulting trip to Brisbane the following Tuesday. 3 nights, returning Friday. That afternoon, while Diane was at work and Callum was out, I sat in my study and searched for professional surveillance installation in the Mornington Peninsula area. I found a company out of Frankston Clearview Protective Solutions. 8 stars, 211 reviews, specializing in discreet residential installations. I emailed from a new account I created on the spot. Available Tuesday morning. Urgent. Family matter. Wife and son cannot know. They replied within the hour. Over dinner that evening, I mentioned I'd be heading to Brisbane on Tuesday as planned. Diane looked at me with that familiar warmth, the warmth I'd built my entire life around, and said she'd miss me. Callum said to bring back some good coffee from that place near the CBD I liked. I said I would. I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling of the bedroom I'd shared with my wife for 26 years, and I thought about how Graham's hands had shaken slightly when he took his cap off. How a man who'd buried his wife with dignity and composure had been visibly uncomfortable telling me the truth about mine. I thought about that for a long time. Tuesday came. I packed my bag with 3 days of clothes and my work laptop. The same bag I'd packed 100 times. Diane made me toast and squeezed my shoulder on her way past. Callum waved from the couch. I put the bag in my car and backed down the driveway, and I drove to my brother's flat in Mount Eliza instead of to Tullamarine Airport. My brother, Dennis, was 60 years old, a retired electrician, and the only person in the world I trusted completely at that moment. I'd called him the night before, told him I needed to use his spare room for a few days without explanation. He'd said the key was under the pot plant and to help myself to whatever was in the fridge. That's Dennis. No questions. Just present. I was back at my own house by 9:30 with the Clearview technician, a solid bloke named Aaron, and his assistant. I walked them through each room with the flat detachment of a man reviewing a project site. Living room, kitchen, hallway, bedroom. I pointed. Aaron nodded, assessed angles, made notes on his tablet. He replaced the smoke detector in the living room, fitted a small device inside the digital clock on the kitchen bench, put one in the hallway, disguised in a PowerPoint fitting. The bedroom was hardest. I stood in the doorway and pointed at the bedside table on Diane's side and said I needed that angle covered. Aaron swapped out the lamp with an identical model. Built-in lens. Motion activated. 4K. Total. 4 cameras. Cloud storage. 60-day retention. Accessible via an app on my phone. Aaron showed me the feeds before he left. Crystal clear. Every corner of my home visible on a 6-inch screen while I stood in Dennis's spare room 30 kilometers away. Whatever's going on, Aaron said quietly at the door. I'm sorry you're in it. I transferred payment and watched his van pull away, and then I sat in my own living room, alone, in the house I'd paid off over 22 years. And I looked at the 4 feeds on my phone. Empty rooms. Just my life. Waiting. I drove to Dennis's. I set up my laptop. I ordered Thai food I barely touched. And I watched. At 9:47 that Tuesday night, Callum left through the front door. The hallway camera caught him clearly. Jacket, keys, phone in hand. He looked back once at the house before he got into his car. The look of someone checking a stage is set. At 10:19, the living room camera activated. The front door opened. A man stepped inside. Tall, silver-haired, well-dressed. The kind of clothes that don't announce themselves but cost more than they let on. He had his own key. He didn't hesitate at the door. Didn't look around. He walked in like the house was familiar. Like it was partly his. Diane appeared from the hallway, She was wearing a dress I didn't recognize, dark blue, and her hair was down. She looked, and I say this with the full weight of what it cost me to notice, she looked happy in a way I hadn't seen in years. He kissed her. I made myself watch. I needed to see it clearly, to know it was real, and not something I was constructing from fear. I activated the audio. They went to the kitchen. He opened a bottle of wine he'd brought. I could see it was a Yarra Valley, red, good label, and poured 2 glasses. They clinked them together with the ease of people who had done this many times. 3 whole nights, he said. He's very reliable. Diane replied, and she laughed softly. You can set your watch by Robert's travel schedule. I wrote down the timestamp. I saved the clip. I uploaded it to 2 separate cloud accounts. I worked like an engineer, not a husband. That was the only way through it. By midnight, I knew his first name was Warren. By the time I drove back to Dennis's at 2 in the morning, I knew he'd be staying again Wednesday night. I didn't sleep. I sat in Dennis's armchair in the dark, and I thought about 31 years. I thought about the night Callum was born, how Diane had held my hand so hard she'd left marks on my knuckles, and how I hadn't minded at all. I thought about the holiday we'd taken to New Zealand for our 20th anniversary, Queenstown, the walks we'd done in the early mornings before anyone else was up. I thought about all the times I'd called home from Brisbane or Sydney, and she'd answered on the second ring and said she missed me. I thought about whether any of it had been real. By Thursday morning, I had 14 hours of footage. Warren arriving. Warren and Diane having breakfast together in my kitchen on Wednesday morning. Callum coming home Wednesday afternoon, walking straight to the kitchen, pouring himself a drink, saying hello to Warren with the familiarity of someone greeting a family friend. That was the moment that shifted something in me permanently. Not the affair, the familiarity. The fact that my son had stood in my kitchen and said, "How's it going?" to the man sleeping in my bed, and then asked his mother whether there was anything to eat. I rewound it and watched it 3 times. Thursday afternoon, I had coffee with Callum's old mate from school, Jaden, who'd stayed in touch with me even after Callum and he had drifted. I didn't mention any of this, but Jaden mentioned, without knowing what it meant to me, that he'd seen Callum out for dinner with that bloke your mum's been seeing back in July. Said Callum had waved at him from across the restaurant. July. 7 months ago. 7 months, my son had known. 7 months of Sunday lunches and Father's Day and him telling me he appreciated everything I'd done for him. I drove back to Dennis's and sat with that for a long time. Friday, I called a family lawyer in Frankston. Rebecca Nguyen, 38 years old, 15 years in family law, recommended by a colleague I trusted. I told her assistant it was urgent. Her office was on the first floor of a building on Yonge Street, clean and professional. Degrees on the wall, a framed quote near the window about truth being the foundation of justice. She shook my hand firmly and gestured to the chair across from her desk. I placed a USB drive between us. I need you to watch 20 minutes of footage, I said. Then I need to understand what my options are. She watched without interrupting. When it finished, she removed her reading glasses and was quiet for a moment. How long have you been married? 31 years. Children? 1 son, 28. He's been living with us for 14 months. He clearly knew about this for at least 7 of those months, possibly longer. Rebecca made notes. In Victoria, the Family Law Act doesn't require proof of fault for divorce. We use a no-fault system. However, evidence like this has significant relevance to asset division, particularly if you can demonstrate that marital assets were used in the course of the affair. It also affects your position considerably in any contested proceedings. She looked up. You said you own the family home outright? Paid off in 2019. Current value? Appraised at $1.1 million last year. She wrote more. We talked for 90 minutes. Asset division. Superannuation splitting. The question of whether Callum had received any financial benefit that might constitute a breach of his duty as a dependent adult still relying on the household. I asked about disinheritance. She explained the legal avenues carefully, without judgment. Before I left, I asked her, "Is there anything I should do before we file?" "One thing," she said. "If you have any reason to question the parentage of your son, and I'm not suggesting you do a DNA confirmation now, closes every possible challenge later in contested estate proceedings. It's standard due diligence in complex cases. I hadn't considered it. Not once in 28 years. I drove home that evening, my real home. I was pretending to have returned from Brisbane, and I walked in, and Diane hugged me and asked how the trip was. And Callum said, "Welcome back," and we had pasta together, and I sat at my own table, like a man watching a play he'd parroted, somehow wandered into. That night, after they'd both gone to bed, I stood in the bathroom and looked at Callum's hairbrush on the shelf above the sink. 31 years of absolute certainty. You don't question the things you're completely certain of. I put on latex gloves from the test kit Rebecca had given me the name of. I collected 3 hair samples, sealed them in the evidence bag, filled out the form. I sat on the edge of the bath for a while afterward, just breathing. Standard due diligence, I told myself. I posted the samples the next morning on my way to the office. I won't describe the week that followed in detail, because the honest truth is that I functioned on the surface and was somewhere else entirely underneath. I went to work. I reviewed project specs. I had lunch with a colleague and talked about the AFL season. I came home and sat at the dinner table and passed the salt when asked and laughed when something was funny on television. All of it felt like I was doing it from a very great distance. The DNA results arrived 9 days later. I was sitting in my car in the car park of a shopping center in Frankston when the email notification came through. I don't know why I was there. I think I'd driven somewhere simply because I needed to be in motion. The PDF loaded. I read the conclusion line 3 times. Probability of paternity, 0%. The tested male is excluded as the biological father of the tested child. I sat in that car for 45 minutes. I watched people pushing trolleys past, a mother lifting a toddler into a car seat, 2 teenagers eating chips on a bench. The completely ordinary, completely indifferent machinery of the world continuing around me while mine disassembled entirely. He wasn't my son. 28 years. I had been present at his birth, had held him before Diane did because she was exhausted, and the midwife placed him in my arms first. I had taught him to kick a football in the back garden of our first house in Seaford. I had driven him to cricket training every Saturday morning for 4 years. I had sat in the waiting room of the Royal Children's Hospital for 6 hours when he was 11 and had a burst appendix, gripping a paper cup of terrible coffee, not moving, not leaving, because leaving felt like it would make something go wrong. 28 years of love that was completely real and had been built on a foundation that was completely false. I called Rebecca. My voice came out strange, too flat. "The paternity results came back," I said. A pause. "I'm very sorry, Robert. This changes the legal picture significantly, and not in her favor. Paternity fraud in this context, deliberate misrepresentation of parentage over the duration of a marriage, constitutes a form of deceit that the court takes seriously in asset division and damages assessment." She paused again. "Do you have any idea who the biological father might be?" I thought about the silver-haired man with his own key to my house. The man Diane had called by a shortened name, with the ease of long familiarity. I thought about how Callum had his height, his coloring, the particular way he tilted his head when he was thinking. I had always assumed Callum looked like Diane's side of the family. "I think I do," I said. I needed to be certain. I called a private investigator named Stuart Park, who had been recommended by a colleague who'd used him in a business dispute. 54 years old, former Victoria police detective, 12 years in private practice. His office was in Moorabbin. Tidy. Professional. I showed him the footage. He watched it the way people watch things they've seen variants of before. Not shocked, just attentive. I need to know who this man is, I said. Full background. And I need to know how long he's known my wife. Give me a week, Stewart said. He called me on the 6th day. His name is Warren Pellegrini. 65 years old. Semi-retired property developer. Lives in Portsea. He and your wife attended the same university in the late 1980s. There are records of a relationship between them that predates your marriage. I was very still. There's more, Stewart said. He has a daughter he's supported financially since 2010. She's 29. Her mother's name is listed as Diane Hadley. Maiden name Fairweather. The room went sideways. I had been told, in October 1995, that Diane had suffered a miscarriage before we met. A previous relationship. She'd told me about it once, quietly, on our 3rd date, and I had held her hand and told her I was sorry and we had never spoken of it again. A daughter, 29 years old, living somewhere, not knowing who her father was, or perhaps knowing exactly who her father was, which would be far worse. I sat in Stewart's office and understood for the first time the full architecture of what had been built around me. Diane had not simply had an affair. She had maintained a second life. Warren Pellegrini had been present at the edges of my marriage from the beginning. The affair hadn't started when I began traveling more, or when Callum moved back in, or at any definable moment. It had never stopped. Stewart had the bank records within 10 days through legitimate legal channels. Over the preceding 4 years, Warren had transferred money to Callum's account 23 times. The total came to just over $19,000. Not a fixed monthly amount like in some kind of grotesque salary arrangement, but regular, deliberate, and clearly conditional on something. The something was me staying oblivious. I have to tell you about the moment I understood that completely. It was a Wednesday evening, perhaps 2 weeks after the DNA results. I was at Dennis's place, and I was watching the live camera feed, something I'd stopped doing obsessively and now only checked once or twice an evening. Callum had come home from wherever he'd been and had gone straight to his room, and Diane was in the kitchen, and I watched her call someone, and I activated the audio. He hasn't said anything, she was saying. He seems completely normal. A pause while the other person spoke. I know. I think we're fine. He doesn't look for things like this. You know Robert, head down, work, trust everything. Always has been. She said it without cruelty. That was the part that got me. Not contempt. Just matter-of-fact assessment of a man she'd lived beside for 31 years and understood completely and had used as a load-bearing wall. I sat with that for a long time. I didn't confront them. I kept working. I let 3 more weeks pass, building the file, documenting everything, creating redundant backups. Stewart's full report ran to 44 pages. Rebecca's legal assessment was comprehensive and, in her words, about as favorable as a contested asset matter can get given the evidence. I updated my will. I removed Callum from my superannuation beneficiary. I redirected my life insurance to Dennis and to the Children's Hospital where they'd taken care of my son, the boy I'd raised when he was 11. That part was hard. He was still the boy from the back garden and the cricket training and the hospital waiting room. That love didn't become false because the biology had. But the man who had taken Warren Pellegrini's money for 4 years to keep his father uninformed was someone I needed to account for separately from the child I remembered. On a Thursday afternoon in late June, I drove to the family home with Rebecca and a process server. I used my own key. Probably the last time. Diane was in the living room reading. Callum was in the kitchen. They both looked up when 3 people walked in. Robert Diane started. Diane Hadley, the process server said. You are being served with a petition for dissolution of marriage. She went very still. I looked at Callum. You too, I said, quietly. The process server handed him the second set of documents. Callum read the top page and went pale. Dad, 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 I know about the payments, I said. Stewart Park tracked every transfer. $19,000 and change, over 4 years. I paused. I also know about the daughter, Warren's and your mother's. I know about the history that predates our marriage. I know about the DNA. I put the results on the coffee table between us. You are not my biological son. Warren Pellegrini is your biological father. Your mother has known this since before you were born. The silence was the loudest thing I have ever heard in my life. Diane's face crumpled. I can explain. You can explain to the court, I said. That's what we have courts for. Callum was looking at the DNA report with his hands shaking. He looked up at Diane. Mum, is this true? She was crying. She didn't answer. He's known you your whole life, I said to Callum. And I heard my voice come out steadier than I expected. You've had dinners with him. He paid you to keep quiet. Think about what that means, not just what it means about me, but what it means about how little he thought of you. That landed. I watched it land. Rebecca stepped forward and walked Diane through the legal summary. 70% of marital assets to me, including sole title to the home. The paternity fraud claim damages assessed at approximately $460,000, representing 28 years of child-rearing costs. 0 spousal maintenance. I wasn't interested in maintenance. I just wanted every single layer of the lie to be on the record. I turned to leave and Callum said, Did you ever actually love me? Knowing what you know now? I stopped at the door. Everything I felt for you was real, I said. Every Saturday morning at cricket, every time I sat in that hospital waiting room, every conversation, that was all real. I loved the son I raised. I still have that. I looked at him directly. But you took money from Warren Pellegrini for 4 years to keep me in the dark. That's not something I can step over. That's a choice you made as an adult about the value of my dignity. I walked out. I sat in my car for a while before I drove away. I didn't feel victorious. Face for watching. Face for watching. I want to be honest about that. It felt like the conclusion of a very long operation, like signing off on a demolition necessary, completed, and nothing to celebrate. The following week, I met with the CEO of the infrastructure firm I consulted for, a woman named Helen, and told her about Warren Pellegrini because he was a significant contractor in the same industry network. She appreciated knowing. That's all I'll say about that. I sent Nancy Pellegrini, Warren's wife, a brief factual letter with the key documents attached. I did it because someone had done that for me. In a sense, Graham Sutton had stood at my letterbox and told me the thing I needed to know. I owed that debt forward. The divorce was finalized 7 months later. The asset settlement reflected exactly what Rebecca had projected. Warren Pellegrini is still dealing with the civil damages component, which was referred to the courts in the new year. Callum completed 200 hours of court-ordered community service for his role in the financial deception. He has tried to contact me 11 times. I have not responded. I don't say that with pride. I say it because it's the truth, and I promised myself I would only deal in truths from here on. I sold the Mornington house. Too many rooms, and none of them felt like mine anymore. I bought a 2-bedroom place in Sorrento, up near the coast, with a study and a decent veranda and a view of the water on clear days. It's smaller than I've lived in for 3 decades. It fits me exactly. I have coffee with Graham Sutton every second Sunday now. He still walks his Kelpie at 6:30 and keeps his garden immaculate. Sometimes we talk about what he told me that morning and sometimes we don't. There's not much that needs to be said about it. He did a hard thing because it was the right thing, and the world needs more of that. Dennis comes around on Friday evenings. We watch whatever sport is on. He has never once said, "I told you so," or offered unsolicited advice, or made me feel like the last 2 years need to be explained or justified. That is its own kind of love, and I've come to understand it's one of the most reliable kinds there is. I went to the coast last month. Just a walk, morning light, water doing its thing against the rocks. I stood there for a while and thought about what it costs to find out the truth about your own life. Not just financially, the family home, the legal fees, the years of income I'd directed toward raising someone else's child without knowing it, but the other costs, the version of the past you have to revise, the memories that don't change but whose meaning shifts underneath them, the particular loneliness of understanding something too late. But I also thought about this. The truth was always there. It existed, whether I knew it or not. Graham, knowing it and telling me, didn't create the wound. The wound was 31 years old. What Graham did was give me the chance to stop bleeding out without knowing why. That's worth something. There are things I understand now that I wish I'd understood 30 years ago, and I'll say them plainly because someone reading this might need to hear them. Trust is not the same as verification. You can love someone completely and still pay attention to what they show you. Love without clear eyes isn't devotion, it's vulnerability that someone else gets to decide the value of. The people who tell you the hard thing are often the ones who deserve the most loyalty, not the ones who've been with you the longest, or the ones who share your name, or the ones who look at you across the dinner table every evening, the ones who stand at their letterbox on an ordinary Thursday morning and decide that your dignity matters more than their own comfort. When someone chooses silence to protect themselves at the cost of your truth, they have already told you exactly who they are. You just have to be willing to hear it. And the last thing, the one that took me the longest to understand, is this. Rebuilding isn't a lesser version of what came before. The 2-bedroom house in Sorrento is not a consolation prize for the life I thought I had. It's a different thing entirely. Smaller in some ways. Cleaner in all of them. Built on ground I've actually checked. I'm 63 years old, and I know exactly what's true in my life now. Some mornings I sit on the veranda with my coffee and watch the water, and I feel something I didn't expect to feel on the other side of all of this. I feel like myself.